Okay, so today we're talking about personal and cultural barriers in Season 4 to mitigating the carbon footprint of research. This is actually quite relevant for me today because I had an invitation this morning to go and speak at a conference in Chicago, and obviously I'm having written what I have about climate-friendly research, I'm having to turn that invitation down. So I've emailed the organisers to ask if there's any way that I can be involved with that conference, for instance, by recording a talk in advance or participating via Skype or something. So I shall wait and see what they say on that one, but it'll be interesting to see what the options are and how the organisers react to that request. So that's maybe something we can talk about more in session 5 with the institutional barriers. So today we have Tobias is going to talk to us about some research that's been conducted by the JPI program about finding out about these personal and cultural barriers, and hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation about that. My background, I'm a climate scientist, so I work at the London School of Economics and I'm surrounded by economists, but I am actually a physicist, so this sort of social science research is quite new to me, but I find it really interesting. And if any of you read my paper, which is on the conference website, you'll see that it talks about these sorts of issues. So climate scientists, ironically, are some of the largest carbon emitters because we spend so much time flying around the world to conferences, meetings, etc. So my paper was about these sorts of issues. And I've tried to ask people within the institutions that I've been at. So that includes Imperial College, where I did my PhD, and now the London School of Economics, where I am now. I've tried to ask people sort of how we can do these sorts of things, how we can make collaboration easier without the climate impact. And actually, it just turns out to be an incredibly difficult question. So I think research programs like this, experiments like this one, this conference, are incredibly important. So I'll hand over to Tobias then. So tell us about this exciting research project.
Thank you very much, Erica. And I'm really happy to be here and stand in front of you, or rather sit in front of you in this virtual conference. I want to thank you a lot that you all participate, and I'm really looking forward to this session. Which is session 4 in the row of this climate-friendly climate research conference. It's been partially named after the research project on the working package I have conducted over this year. And this session 4 is now called Overcoming Personal and Cultural Barriers to Mitigating the Carbon Footprint of Research. I think this is pretty straightforward, and I'd like to ask all the participants to really engage in this session and type your comments and your questions in the chat, as Erica has already pointed out. I will go through the outline of the presentation now. So firstly, I will shortly describe where I'm coming from, so how the working package I have done was constructed, so that you have an idea where the information I'm going to tell you is coming from. Then the lecture is basically divided into 4 main points. We're going to start off with cultural barriers to sustainability, not only in the research world, but also in general. And then I have oriented my presentation, this one and also the one for session 5, which is directly subsequent, on the design you maybe have already got to know in the last session, which was split in 3 parts. So I'm going to continue with the research infrastructure, then come to research events, and finally end up with communication. At the end, there will be a bigger block with feedback, interaction, audience participation. Also, to make this event more interesting for all of you, we have thought about ways to engage with you. So after each and every thematic block, there will be 1 or 2 where you can express your opinion. And also, I left some room for feedback session for answering questions. And these blocks will be moderated by Erica, of course. So let me just shortly start with what I project, because today I'm going to mostly present you the results of this project, and in this way I hope I can make clear to you what the cultural and personal barriers are in this session, and then also what the institutional barriers are in the next session. It's kind of hard to divide these 2 topics, so there will be quite some overlaps between this and the next session, but I hope you can cope with me and just follow through. And as I said, if you have any questions, just raise them, and I'll be really happy to answer them. So I based this session on the cultural and personal barriers on a quantitative feasibility assessment I conducted over the course of the summer, in which I asked scientists in the framework of the JPI Climate, which is also our funding partner. I asked scientists within that framework a couple of questions based on the research results from the work package you've just heard. So I conducted basically a feasibility assessment, concentrating on the institutional setup, so the research infrastructure, research events, and communication. The participants of that survey came from numerous countries around Europe. There were quite some feedback from Austria, but mostly also Nordic countries or Northern European countries were represented. In general, it was about the identification of institutional and personal barriers to the implementation of the solutions that Günther and Bernhard have just presented. So, to start with the cultural barriers, and I'd also like Erica to jump in and report from her experience. I'm going to start really general and just touch on that slightly, because just this slide would be a whole lecture for itself. So what are the cultural barriers in our society we live in? And I must apologize right now, this is a quite Eurocentric view I have, and I'm happy to get feedback from other continents on how they see this culture has implications on the way people act sustainably or unsustainably. So what are these cultural barriers? It's basically coming from rules, habits, and organizations, which is, of course, really broad terms, but it's all about our current socio-political and mostly economic paradigm we live in. This is the so-called system we always talk about. So this system sets us in a certain context where we live, how we live, so we are embedded in our societies, and sometimes don't have the possibility to escape that, or actually quite often. And this often hinders our sustainable acting, which I will get into more detail in what this means for research. But to be embedded in our society often means that it's always about, or often about, the cheap solution. It's mostly about the comfortable solution, and certainly about convenient solutions. And it's really difficult to combine these values or habits and rules with a sustainable society like we have it in mind. So what this means for organizations that want to foster sustainable societies is that they can either ignore these rules, habits, and organizations, or they can accommodate them. And neither is a really attractive framework for society to live in, because this means you have to cut back. You have to cut back on consumerism, on traveling, on the way of life you've gotten used to. A second point is a lack of public understanding and identification. And I trace this back to the very scientific nature of the topic, because climate change is a topic which is dominated by a scientific discourse and is often only hardly understood by the general public, who's also has to cope with different problems, personal problems, finding a job, getting enough food, having your family set up in the right place, being healthy. So they don't really concern or identify themselves with problems of climate change, which is also possible because our society is kind of disconnected from nature. It's not only that urbanization is a huge topic in our society, but that in general, no matter where you live, and this is also again my Eurocentric view, you are just disconnected. You don't have a real feeling of what it means, what nature is, what are the biophysical processes that underlie it, and what is the actual impact humans have on nature. Another point why there's only little public understanding and identification, and this adds to this disconnectedness from nature, is that with climate change there is often no immediate feedback. And people need immediate feedback to realize that certain things go wrong. And especially in Europe, this might be quite a tough view, but we are, compared to other continents, quite spoiled when it comes to the effects of climate change. I mean, there are floods and droughts, but we've just recently experienced a horrible storm which hit the Philippines, and this is a whole another dimension than Europe. So, I mean, it's debatable if this storm is an actual direct cause of climate change, but still, research indicates that there's an increasing amount of natural disasters which will not be felt by the people who actually cause climate change, which is the 1 billion people that our socioeconomic paradigm is catering for, mostly in Europe, the United States, and in other developed countries. Another point I'd like to stress is this lack of a sense of individual agency, which basically translates to what can oneself do? So what is my influence in this whole thing? And this influence is often denied or neglected. And so single persons often don't feel the ability to change something, and certainly don't see themselves as change agents who can influence other people. So they think, I don't care about it because I can't do anything about it anyways. So what are cultural barriers for research institutions then? I mean, it's kind of the same what we already had in the introduction to the topic yesterday by Adam and others. It's a sense of increased international cooperation, which drives the research community to ever more flying and to ever more traveling, to be present at ever more conferences and to publish more and be present. And this carbon-intensive working style is not only in terms of flying and traveling, but also in terms of resource-intensive infrastructures. And a good example of this is me sitting here right now. My university, the University of Economics and Business in Vienna, just moved to this brand new campus, which is pretty nice, which was designed to the newest standards of ecological housing. So it's got a quite good performance in terms of in-house ecology, but on the other hand, the old campus was just 30 years old. So this, you could on the one hand say, okay, we moved to a new campus and are using the resources more intensively and more efficiently, but then on the other hand, buildings are designed for such short periods that in the end it won't matter. I've already talked about the travel practices of researchers, which means it's mostly centered on flying because it's more convenient, and we've heard in last session that it's mostly also cheaper. And it's also saving time. And the time constraint is a criterion also the researchers mentioned in my survey. So 38% of researchers said they actually prefer flying because of time constraints. To save time. So let me go on into more detail about the science community. No, this error. Okay. Actually, in my survey, what I found out is that the general mood for climate-friendly research is overwhelmingly positive. The next slide will not show you this because there is a graphic missing. Maybe David can help me with that. I can also just tell you what it says. It tells you, I ask how important do you think it is that your institution greens its activities, and it was 94% actually said that it is very important or important that the institutions they work at green their activities. So does this mean that there's a favorable environment for increased regulation? And I'd say yes, partially, because around 3/4 of the respondents said that they would be willing to change, for example, in commuting habits, so changing from car commuting to bike or public transport, to reduce business trips, to switch to more energy efficient equipment, or use the materials in their office with more care. And I'm going to dive into that in more detail later. So this is the missing graphic, and now I'd like to have a first feedback session and a poll. I'm not quite sure if you can see this right now. I'd like to ask you to answer the questions. Maybe some feedback from you if you can see this. Oh yeah, there's something happening. So this is the first poll. I'd like to ask you to answer the questions. There is multiple answers possible, so you don't have to decide for just one. And it is about where would you like or can you think of greening your own activities at work? I have not answered it myself. I'm not going to answer it myself, but Erica has maybe connected some questions already, and then we can introduce the poll data.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tobias. So we've already got a few comments coming in from people. I asked if the international participants had any reflections on different cultural constraints in their area, and we've got two interesting responses there. So one about from Bettina Posselt about travel in the US, where distances are just larger than in Europe, and that to the next university often requires taking the car or a plane, so it's difficult even to discuss the travel issue because other options maybe aren't necessarily there. And she says that there's another cultural issue in that the Greyhound is seen as something for people who can't afford to fly. So that really brings it back to the sort of cultural and personal issues as well, even if that is technically an option. And Inga Vesper says journalists are always expected to be there to be credible, even when it's not strictly necessary. So for things like report launches, conference results, or inaugurations. So if journalists have to report on something, you know, it's important for them to be seen standing in front of the thing that they're reporting, even if they're not necessarily, even if it's not actually required to talk about it. Okay, so if anyone else has any more comments, then feel free to feed them in. So Adam,
yeah, sorry,
or Tobias, do you think this reflects the poll that in your study? We have 100% who are willing to switch to virtual communication, which probably represents selection bias because this is everybody who's willing to turn up today.
This is a really good example of selection bias. No, this not really reflects the results, but kind of. So the audience here is more aware of their own activities, I have the feeling, and is more eager to green them in all the aspects. But I'd like to comment on what I think Bettina posed with the traveling issue in the US. This is not, of course, also a institutional barrier, which I'll come on to later in my second session. But in terms of international traveling, it also makes sense to rethink their own travel plans and not just go to the conference overseas, but maybe connect it to a vacation of 2 weeks or plan back-to-back conferences on one country. It's also very much about a smarter travel planning.
And another question, which was that, you know, you mentioned that people say that they choose the plane because it's cheap and quick and convenient. How does that relate to things like Adobe Connect and these kinds of technologies? Because obviously this is cheaper, quicker, and more convenient. You know, I don't even have to leave my living room and I can join in. So how come that sort of these advantages don't get through to people, you know, when we're considering the difference between electronic communication and the plane, when it's so important between the plane and the train? Is there something else going on there?
Yeah, I think it's mainly due to two different reasons. It's the maturity of the technology, and then second, its popularity. Maybe beginning with the latter, it's not popular in our culture to have these kind of meetings yet, I'd say. There's a lot of positive influence from that direction in the US, coming from technologically really advanced countries who use these kinds of technologies way more than the rest of the world, I'd say. And in terms of maturity of technology, it's just that people, I have the feeling, haven't really adapted to what the actual potential is. Technology has developed really fast in the last 10-15 years, and the mindset of the people just hasn't adapted yet. And I think it still needs some time for people to adjust and for a concept like this online conference to really develop their full potential. And I mean, as we speak, this is a real world experiment. So this research project has actually also the task to create this online conference and test it, which is also an indication for it not being mainstream.
Great. We have another comment from Gunther as well, saying, I think going by plane up to now is seen as a privilege, a status symbol, or sort of an upper class habit, although flying today is often a torture. I do this as well. You know, I see my colleagues flying all over the place, and actually they hate it. You know, but it still has this this sort of rhetoric around it of being, you know, the thing to do. Gunther says flying today is often a torture, and going by bus or train is comfortable. For example, the night in sleeping coaches, you get breakfast served, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think Adam also has a question. He's desperately raised his hand, I see.
Go ahead, Adam.
Thank you, Tobias. Yes, I would like to chip in with sort of a bit of a question / comment. You mentioned the issue of time constraints with regard to choosing train travel as opposed to air travel, and I think that's that's a sort of interesting question because I mean we've had a look at this issue, and if you compare sort of, you know, I'm obviously with a long haul, then there's, you know, there's no question that the plane is going to be sort of quicker. But if you look at, you know, a sort of the actually going to the airport, which is out of town, the check-in times involved, and so on and so forth, along with the fact that the actual work time when you fly a 1 hour flight, you know, with the sort of the 5 or 6 hours it actually takes you to get from A to B altogether, is practically zero. Whereas if you take the train, which might take 2 or 3 hours longer, then you actually have decent work time sitting in the train. And I think sort of one of the things we need to start looking at are different models. So Sebastian is online now, and he was very central in setting up the rules for business travel in the framework of the Climate Change Centre Austria, which actually stipulate that, you know, sort of on the one hand, you know, it's need to be the preferred means of transport, but there's actually this sort of relationship of trust that says, yeah, you can book that as time worked, and there's this issue of trust of actually working, you know, whilst you're sitting in the train and then booking it, which makes the time constraint issue yeah, a lot less of an issue.
Yes, thank you, Adam. And I'm going to come back in more detail on traveling by train in my session or my thematic block on events. So I'd like to cut it off here a little without, I don't want to cut you off content-wise, Adam, because I totally agree what you say, but I'm going to come back to that later. So the second thematic block is on the research infrastructure. And for those of you who haven't been there session before, we're Gunther already elaborated on that. Just as a short reminder, research infrastructure is mostly about guidelines for greening research infrastructure. So it's all about green procurement, setting up and maintaining green buildings, and environmental management system, the most popular of which in Europe is the EMAS, but there is also international certifications like the LEED certificate, which is mostly for buildings. And what I found out in my research is that actually these guidelines for greening research infrastructure are well known by the science professionals. And the details of which we have heard in session 3. But it's kind of in, oh, there's the graphic missing again. This is inconvenient. Let me tell you what it says. I have asked the participants if they had any contact with organizational support infrastructures for greening initiatives or green guidelines. And astonishingly, it was only 43% who agreed to this. So only 43% actually have had contact. And this means, on the other hand, that 57% haven't had contact. So what this means is that the research the infrastructure for green buildings and for greening research infrastructure is kind of not really developed at universities. It's kind of a 50-50 if they're there or not. But they're known. So there's a clear lack between the popularity of these certification systems and the actual existence of them. So let me maybe come to, because the graphic is not really working, let me come to kind of barriers in terms of commuting. So one thing I counted into research infrastructure is how researchers actually go to work. And that's also a question I'd like to raise in the next poll. So the question about commuting habits. the results showed that about 30% of researchers mostly use their car, but that also 40% use public transport to get to work. These figures are both for more than 80% of the time they're commuting. And this reflects, on the one hand, that car travel is still dominant, but not dominated. It is dominated by public transport, which means that, which also reflects that research institutions are mostly located in cities where the public transport infrastructure is actually really good. Nevertheless, there's still barriers to public transport. And when asked, most people indicate that that either the travel time too long, so that it takes too long to get from home to work. That's mostly also connected to inconvenient connections. So you have to switch train or means of transport for 1, 2, or more times. Then also in terms of schedule, that departure or arrival times are actually inconvenient to when you actually want to start work or want to get home. And another issue, which is more political, is that there is always, in many countries, there is cities for car commuters that travel over a longer distance. The same thing goes for barriers to biking and walking. In many cities around the world, the biking or walking infrastructure is actually really poor. There is some exceptions, like Northern European countries and also Central European countries, but most of the cities haven't had the chance or the money to develop a biking infrastructure that also has positive environmental effects. So coming to the next slide, what is actually, or what is the resistance to the implementation of climate-friendly measures? And what I found out in my research is that this largely depends on the environmental awareness of science professionals. So the question is a researcher opposed to the introduction of an environmental audit scheme, such as EMAS, for example? And this shows that actually it really much depends on not the general, not the awareness of the personal researcher or single researchers, but the awareness among the whole scientific professional community within an institute. So acceptance is really crucial in that matter. What is really important in many institutes, what I found out, is the role of change agents who live sustainability in their daily life, in their work life, and thus also communicate this to all other colleagues, which can have a really positive role. Another positive side effect, which kind of counters this resistance to the implementation of climate-friendly measures, is that organizations that get certified actually gain in attractiveness, not only for employers, but also for potential business clients or students. So now I think it's time for the second poll. Let me just get that. And it's about, as already said, how do you actually get to work? Thank you for enlarging that. This time I will participate. Maybe we can discuss these results in more detail now in our feedback session, and I hope Erica has collected some questions.
Yeah, great. So again, I think we're suffering from something of a biased sample here, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending how you look at it. We've got a couple of comments coming in about other issues. So, for instance, an additional reason for driving, says Martin Johnson, is needing to take children to school or nursery, which makes public transport he says really impossible for some people. I guess that depends a bit on the children. Mandy makes a really good point about sort of there are lots of positive aspects of these online conferences, but she also sees that her colleagues don't respect the fact that she's at an online conference. If you're really at a conference somewhere else and you're actually gone and out of the building, then you're gone and you can focus on it. But when you're in an online meeting, people can still come and disturb you. So that was a really good point there. Got a few people agreeing with that. And then back to the transport issue. So Debbie Hopkins from New Zealand says that poor roads make a bus less of an option for her. To get to Christchurch from Dunedin would take 5 or 6 hours, so maybe that's less possible. But then another positive point in favour of online working, Mandy Schoenemann says, I'm pregnant and I'm not much able to travel, but I can participate now, so that's a big plus. So that's nice to hear as well. Thanks, Mandy.
I gotta add that to my list of positive side effects of online conferences. I'm afraid I haven't thought of that before. Okay, so I think if there's not that many questions, we can shortly interpret the poll results, and which are, I think, kind of biased because they don't really reflect what I found out in my research, but it's really it gives me a positive feeling that actually 66% or 2/3 of all the people bike or walk to work, which I personally also do, and I kind of enjoy because it also kind of clears the head, but sometimes it's also a bit rough, of course, depending on where you live. So let me just get rid of that poll and go on with my presentation. And now I turn to research events. They're mostly about minimizing the environmental impacts of event activities, which we've already heard in session 3. And the biggest part of that is, of course, travel and local transportation, which I will dive into in more detail a little bit later. But it's also about resource and energy use, how you select your venue, so where the research event takes place, food provisioning and disposal, accommodation and waste management. And to make to you more clear what events are, it's actually not only conferences, but also project meetings, workshops, every scientific event you can think of where you have to travel to. In terms of greening events, my research, my survey found out that actually 80% of respondents have never organized such an event, and also 61% have never attended an event that was classified or named as green event or green meeting. Where such events take place is mostly due to change agents, which I've already talked about a little bit before. So green event guidelines or the organization of green events still mostly focuses on single persons and is in no way broadly implemented into the system. But although almost none of the participants has organized and only 60% have, 40% have attended a green event, the personal attitude in general is pretty positive. So of those 80% who've not organized a conference, 71% strongly agree or agree to organize a green event in the future, and this symbolizes a huge potential for future guidelines, I guess. Only 6% disagree, so you could also say that's not only there's a huge potential, but also the resistance to such green guidelines when established into research institutes would be comparatively low. I've also asked about the resource use at conferences, and I put in 2 topics, which is the diet and the use of resources. And 82% of the respondents actually indicated that it should be more regional and organic or meatless options available. Almost 90% think it's very important to reduce the amount of distributed paper. So these numbers show that there is actually quite a huge potential. So I ask myself, is there an unwillingness to act, because green events are not that popular and not that common. And 48% of the researchers stated that nothing actually prevents them from organizing events, and I kind of would like to argue against that, because in my qualitative research I've actually found out that there is quite a high reservations against green events, especially when it comes to the fear of higher costs or increased time effort you have to put in to organize such a green event. But what I also found out, or what researchers have told me that have organized such meetings, is that the costs are not necessarily higher, because you're also able to save money. And this is not only for the dietary options you provide, but also for the venue you select, where you hold the conference. So it could mean a potential cost saving. And I kind of also count this online conference to a green event, although we haven't really articulated it at that. But the costs we save for holding this conference is virtually and not in person is actually the saving we have is quite significant. What maybe triggers this unwillingness to act is again, mostly cultural and systematic issues, because we have these traditional working and organization habits, and if you then organize or start organizing green events, this means, of course, that suddenly have to break with them, and this needs time and effort to organize a green event. But there's always low-hanging fruits you can start with, which are pretty easy. So when you start organizing green events, it doesn't mean that you have to make it green all the way through from the beginning, but start with the low-hanging fruits and then get more advanced if you keep organizing them in a green way. So what are the arguments that would help to overcome these barriers I've just mentioned is that actually what researchers told me is that conferences that are declared as a green event have actually a really distinctive feature to them, which is really important when you think of the competitiveness between scientific events, conferences, and such. This distinctive event could really make you stand out. And also participants who are taking part in these conferences or research events build kind of an emotional attachment to this conference. So it's more than just a regular meeting, and this emotional attachment can of course be positive and negative. It's of course mostly positive because people are impressed that you actually organize such an event, but it could also be negative, that they're annoyed by certain things or say it's not been thought through, why haven't you done this? But this also is then a really good feedback mechanism. So I'd like to raise two polls now again. Let me shortly select it, which is, have you ever participated in an event which specifically took ecological criteria into account? And then let me just follow up a question once you've already answered this. Maybe in the meantime, Erica, are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, we've got a couple of comments. So Inga Vesper says that the last Arctic Council in Brussels asked people to justify their travel means and think about alternatives. Participants said that hearing about these options that other people chose really made a difference in the way they planned their travel. And Martin Johnson from UEA says, I think that some anecdotes about the positive aspects of biking to work or taking the train for meetings to inform other people would be a really useful resource for changing opinions. I've noticed that myself. So, for instance, I remember reading a blog by Kevin Anderson from the Centre about how he took the train to China for a meeting, and he wrote about it in such a positive way, and said how much work he got done and how enjoyable it was, and he managed to sort of sit on the train and write several papers without being disturbed by his colleagues. You know, that I thought that was a really positive anecdote. You know, and a few more of these, and people talking in a positive way about getting the train or biking to work and all these sorts of things can only be positive for encouraging other people to do the same.
So looking at the results, it's also quite biased again, I guess, because 70% actually have participated in such an event. So let me just select the second poll. And this is in turn about the organization of such an event, and I'm really excited to see what the results are going to be here. By the way, after this poll, I'm then turning to the actual travel practices for events, which I haven't quite covered yet. And I don't want to get into trouble with time, Erica. Do you have any more comments and questions? Maybe you could also postpone them for a later, bigger discussion.
Yep, I think we can move on. Yeah.
Okay. So just short result, you can see it all. Have you ever organized an event? And actually 6 people have. Which is also not kind of unrepresentative, but still a really positive notion of who's actually participating here right now. So coming to travel and transportation, we've heard yesterday that around 70% of emissions in the realm of events are actually stemming from travel and transportation, which is mostly due to the popularity of flying. It's being really cheap and also simple to book. One notion we haven't or we have already touched upon a little is the conference tourism. I have asked the researchers to indicate their travel practices over the last 12 months. And just shortly go through them. There were some quite astonishing results, I think, because what was not astonishing was that only a third did not fly long distance. 50% of researchers flew 1 to 5 times, and 20% even over 5 times. What was astonishing was that actually 68% have indicated that they haven't used any short distance flights under 750 kilometers. When it comes to train travel, that was also kind of positive, I thought, is that 73% used the train at least once, 30% over 5 times, and 15% over 10 times. And I think this is a really encouraging result. However, for night trains, which Helga Komkolb yesterday advocated in her introduction speech, is not really reflected here that this is popular, because 95% said that they actually haven't used the night train. Same thing goes for bus travel. So long distance buses have hardly been used, and cars are, on the other hand, quite popular, as about 75% have used a car less than 5 times, 12% over 10 times, and 5% even over 40 times. So let's talk about overcoming travel barriers. The results showed that actually 68% think about refraining from short distance flights, and all the others that indicated they wouldn't do so indicated that it's long travel times, inconvenient connections that prevents them. Of these 68%, actually 54% said that nothing actively prevents them, which is kind of due to the fact that the booking for flights is mostly done personally. But then on the other hand, I'd argue that the accessibility of alternatives to train travel is actually a barrier that prevents people from flying. What I found out, or my impression, is that participants of research events often do not care to know about alternatives to flying because it's just not within our economic and organizational paradigm. Going on that is how can we overcome travel barriers is actually the choice of venue is pretty decisive, and I've already said before, it really depends where you locate a conference or a research event. It makes a difference if it's in Central Europe or in the periphery. What also kind of helps and would be a good argument or a good method to foster alternatives to flying is that is the method of informing participants about the available connections and facilitating their local transport. And with available connections, of course, mean train connections or bus connections, so alternatives to flying. And all in all, I'd say it's not about the complete replacement of flying, which I would like to have, but I think it's just not feasible. But about a more considerate planning, which I've already indicated before. That means that you plan your conferences ahead, you have them back to back, or connect them with vacations, and wherever you have, can also think about CO2 compensation programs, and there will be a session about that later that week. So, looking at the time, I'd say I just go on to my last thematic point and then leave some room for discussion. It's about greening communication, and we've heard a little bit about that already in session 3, and we'll hear more about that in session tomorrow. It's online synchronous online communication, which is basically what we're doing here at this conference and which we've already used in the CFCR project. My research found out that actually green synchronous online communication is broadly known and applied. So 87% of researchers actually know it. But there is a potential for its improvements in terms of usage intensity. The preference for which kind of technology is used is mostly dominated by Skype with 84%. But online meeting systems such as Adobe Connect, which we're using right now, is also pretty popular, and online collaboration tools such as Google Docs, for example, or Dropbox are a little less popular. So what are the barriers to these communication technologies? Of course, it's mostly logical difficulties you have. There is a preference for personal meetings of researchers that haven't used them. There often is a lack of affinity and knowledge as technology develops quite fast and it is hard to catch up with the newest developments. And another barrier is that there is a lack of training for researchers, and I will get back to that later in my institutional barriers, what this means. How can we overcome these barriers? I'd say, as in all these points, there is a need for awareness building and a need to point at the positive ecological effects, and also kind of overcoming these barriers is to make people use alternatives to Skype, because Skype is actually a pretty easy and simple tool, but tools like, for example, Adobe Connect are way more comprehensive and useful when it comes to conferencing. All right, I'd like to raise our last poll, for which kind of virtual meetings, for which kind of activity would you prefer virtual meetings? And let me just, this is the last one. Let me just change this shortly. So here you go. And during that, we can already answer some questions and discuss some comments. Erica and me will continue in session 5. We can overshoot a little, I'd say, but not too much.
Yeah, and I think this session and the next session are very linked as well. The institutional barriers and the personal and cultural barriers are so similar and so interlinked anyway that I don't think it matters if we just merge one into. Great, okay, so does anyone else have any more comments then? Please feel free to write in the chat box on the right-hand side, or to put your hand up if you want to chime in with a question on audio. I had a question. I wondered if there might be an age issue here as well in terms of virtual meetings and the take-up of these kind of technologies, because maybe, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but I think possibly the younger researchers might be more likely to want to embrace these sorts of new electronic technologies, but perhaps it's the more senior researchers who have control over how meetings actually happen and when and where they're going to be, and maybe have expectations and maybe don't have time to be trained in how to use these technologies. So could there be some kind of issue there?
You might think there is an issue there, and from our personal experience, you can actually tell that there is. But my research did not indicate that clearly. So it was actually kind of equal between young and old researchers in how far they used modern communication technologies, which I found really astonishing, but which might also be just not a really valid result. I have quite a short number of, or a low number of participants, so there might be some bias in there. But in general, I think the difference between older and younger researchers is getting less and less, because the research community itself has been faced with these technological challenges, I would call them now, for a long time now, and I haven't heard of anyone in my institute of not being able answering emails or talking over Skype.
Good, that's really positive.
All right. Are there any other questions? The poll results are really clear. There was, only a single answer possible, which led to project meetings as dominating with 91.6%.
I think part of the issue here might be that we can only choose one option. Maybe people would have been able to choose more than one option.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, I'm not quite sure.
So would people like to make any comments on why, why conferences, for instance, would be less appropriate using virtual technologies, virtual meetings? There was an article in Science the other day about what's lost when a meeting goes virtual, talking about how people really value the sort of the face-to-face interactions, not necessarily even in the conference room, but in the pub afterwards. So the JPI, this conference today, we have our coffee lounge, which is an attempt to capture that. So people's reflections on whether that's any good, whether that works, whether that somehow replicates the environment of being in the pub after the talks after a conference, would be really interesting.